The carriage wheels had barely stopped turning when the gates of Ashworth Hall burst open with shouts of joy. Servants ran out into the cold morning air, candles still in hand from the night watch, calling out that the Duke had finally come home. Bells rang from the small chapel near the stables. Even the horses in the field lifted their heads, as if they too understood that something important was happening. For 3 long years, the war had taken Duke Edmund Ashworth far from his family, his land, and everything familiar to him. Letters had come rarely, and when they did, they said little. The family had learned to live with worry as a quiet companion, always present but never spoken about out loud. Now, at last, that worry could rest. The Duke was home. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, was the first to reach him. She wrapped her arms around her son so tightly that onlookers feared she might never let go. Tears ran freely down her face, but they were tears of relief, not sorrow. His younger brother Henry clapped him on the back and laughed loudly, already calling for wine to celebrate. The household staff bowed and smiled, whispering among themselves about how fine the Duke looked in his uniform, how proud they all were of him. Only one person standing at the edge of the crowd did not smile so easily. Lady Cecilia Hartwell stood a little apart from the others, her hands folded neatly in front of her plain gray dress. She was the quiet companion to the Dowager Duchess, a woman without great wealth or title of her own, but with sharp eyes and a gentle heart. She had served in the household for almost 2 years, arriving not long after the Duke had left for war. She had never met him before that morning, yet something about him struck her immediately. It was not his face, though he was handsome enough, with strong features weathered by sun and hardship. It was not his uniform, though it was sharp and clean despite the long journey. It was something in his eyes, a flicker, there and gone again, like a candle struggling against the wind. Everyone else saw a hero returning triumphant. Cecilia saw a man trying very hard to look like one. That evening, a grand dinner was held in the Duke's honor. The long table in the dining hall was filled with food the kitchen had been preparing for days, and laughter echoed off the high stone walls. Edmund sat at the head of the table, smiling and nodding, as relatives and neighbors offered their congratulations and asked him questions about the war. "Tell us," said an old family friend, leaning forward eagerly, "what was it like to lead men into battle?" Edmund's smile did not falter, but Cecilia, seated quietly near the far end of the table, noticed the slight pause before he answered. It was only a heartbeat, barely noticeable, but it was there. "It was an honor to serve," he said simply, lifting his glass as if to end the conversation before it could go further. The guests cheered and drank to his honor, satisfied with the answer. No one pressed him further. No one, it seemed, except Cecilia, who watched his hand tighten slightly around the stem of his glass before he set it down. Later that night, long after the guests had gone home, and the household had settled into sleep, Cecilia found she could not rest. Her small room was located near the east wing, not far from the Duke's private chambers, a placement she had never thought much about until now. As she lay awake, she heard footsteps, slow, steady, pacing footsteps, back and forth across a wooden floor. She rose quietly and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, telling herself she was only checking that nothing was wrong, that perhaps a window had been left open somewhere. She walked softly down the corridor until she reached the door of the Duke's study, where a thin line of candlelight glowed beneath the door. She did not knock, she simply listened, feeling a little ashamed of herself for doing so, yet unable to walk away. Inside, she heard him speaking, low and urgent, though there was no one else in the room. The words were not clear, but the tone was unmistakable, fear, or something close to it. She stood there for a long moment, before finally turning and walking back to her room, her heart heavy with a worry she could not yet explain. In the days that followed, life at Ashworth Hall returned to its usual rhythm. The Duke attended to estate matters, rode out to inspect the fields, and met with his steward about matters of business. To anyone watching from a distance, he seemed every bit the capable, confident man his title required him to be. But Cecilia continued to notice the small things, the way he flinched when a door slammed somewhere in the house, the way his hands trembled, just slightly, when he poured his tea, though he always steadied them quickly before anyone else could see, the way he sometimes stared out of windows for long stretches of time, his expression distant, as though his body had returned from the war, but some part of his mind had stayed behind. She said nothing to anyone. It was not her place, she reminded herself. She was a companion to the Dowager Duchess, not a confidant to the Duke. Yet she found herself watching him with growing concern, the way one might watch a candle flickering dangerously close to burning out. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens to gather flowers for the Duchess's sitting room, Cecilia came upon Edmund sitting alone on a stone bench near the old fountain. He did not notice her at first, lost in thought, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the garden walls. "Your Grace," she said softly, not wishing to startle him. He turned quickly, and for just a moment, before he composed himself, she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the polite, practiced expression he wore for everyone else. "Lady Cecilia, I did not hear you approach. I did not mean to disturb you," she said. "I can leave you in peace." "No," he said, surprising her. "Please, stay, if you wish." She sat at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them, and for a while neither of them spoke. The fountain trickled softly nearby, and birds called from the trees above. It was Edmund who finally broke the silence. "Do you find the garden peaceful, Lady Cecilia?" "I do," she answered. "There is something honest about a garden. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though her words had struck something deep within him. "That is a rare quality," he said quietly. "Honesty." She did not press him to explain what he meant. Instead, she simply nodded and allowed the silence to settle comfortably between them once more. When she rose to leave a few minutes later, he thanked her, though for what exactly, neither of them said aloud. That small meeting in the garden became the first of many. Over the following weeks, Cecilia and Edmund found themselves crossing paths more often. In the library, in the quiet hours after dinner, during early morning walks before the rest of the household had risen. Each time, she offered him the same simple gift, her presence, without demands, without questions he was not ready to answer. Slowly, carefully, like a man testing ice before stepping fully onto it, Edmund began to open up to her. It started with small things, a memory of a fellow soldier who had made him laugh during a difficult march, a description of a foreign sky he had once watched at sunset. But as trust grew between them, the conversations deepened. One evening, as autumn rain tapped gently against the library windows, Edmund finally spoke of the burden he had carried home with him. "There was a man under my command," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. "A good man, younger than me, full of hope for what waited for him after the war. A wife, a small farm, a quiet life. I made a decision that day, one I believed was right at the time. He did not survive it." Cecilia did not speak. She simply waited, allowing him the space to continue. "I have replayed that moment 1,000 times," Edmund went on, "wondering if a different choice would have saved him. I returned home a hero, they tell me, decorated for my service. But I do not feel like a hero, Lady Cecilia. I feel like a man wearing another man's medals. You feel as though you do not deserve the celebration, she said gently. Yes, he admitted, the word barely more than a whisper. And I fear that if my family truly saw what I carry inside me, they would not recognize the son and brother who left them 3 years ago. So I smile, I perform. I let them believe the war returned me whole, because the alternative frightens me more than the war itself ever did. Cecilia reached out, not touching him, but simply resting her hand near his on the table between them, close enough to offer comfort without overstepping. You do not have to perform for me, she said. I see you, Your Grace. Not the hero they celebrate, but the man who is trying, every day, to find his way back to himself. That man is worthy of respect, perhaps even more than the hero they imagine. For the first time since his return, Edmund felt something loosen in his chest, a weight he had not realized he was still carrying so tightly. In the months that followed, their bond deepened into something neither of them had expected, nor sought, yet could not deny. Cecilia, too, found herself sharing pieces of her own life she had long kept hidden, the quiet grief of growing up without a true place to belong, the loneliness of a life spent in service to others, while her own dreams remained unspoken. With Edmund, she did not have to be merely a companion. She could simply be herself. They never spoke openly of romance, not at first. Their connection grew in small gestures, a shared glance across the dinner table, a quiet word of encouragement before a difficult meeting with the estate's creditors, a comfortable silence shared while reading in the library on rainy afternoons. But anyone who watched closely, as Cecilia herself had once watched Edmund, would have noticed the way his eyes softened whenever she entered a room, or the way her smile came easier in his presence than anywhere else. The Dowager Duchess noticed too. Margaret had not survived the loss of her husband and the long uncertainty of her son's absence at war by being unobservant. She watched the way Edmund's gaze lingered on Cecilia during family gatherings, the way he seemed lighter, somehow more present, whenever she was near. And while a mother's heart might have rejoiced to see her son finding comfort after such hardship, a duchess's mind worried over matters of status, family alliances, and the future of the Ashworth name. Edmund, she said to him one evening, after the rest of the household had retired, the Earl of Whitmore has a daughter of marrying age. A union between our families would secure important alliances, particularly given the difficulties our estate faced during your absence. Edmund's jaw tightened. Mother, I have only just returned home. Surely there is no urgency in this matter. There is every urgency, Margaret replied firmly. You are the Duke now, Edmund, whether you feel ready for the role or not. Your duty is not only to yourself. He did not argue further that night, but the conversation weighed on him heavily. He knew his mother's concerns were not without reason. The estate had suffered during his absence, and a strong alliance could secure its future for generations. Yet the thought of a marriage built solely on calculation and convenience, rather than genuine connection, felt like another battlefield he was not prepared to face. Word of the proposed match spread quickly through the household, as such things always did. Cecilia heard of it not from Edmund himself, but from the whispered conversations of the kitchen staff. She told herself it was not her concern, that the Duke's marriage was a matter far beyond her station, yet the news settled in her chest like a stone. She began, quietly and without announcement, to prepare to leave Ashworth Hall. It was not an easy decision. She had found, in this household, something she had never expected: purpose, friendship, and a connection with a man she had come to care for deeply, even if she had never allowed herself to name that feeling fully. But she would not be the reason a struggling estate lost the alliance it desperately needed. nor would she place Edmund in a position where he had to choose between duty and whatever feelings he might hold for a companion of no great fortune. She wrote a letter to a distant cousin in the north, inquiring about a position as governess to her children, and began quietly packing her few belongings. Edmund noticed her absence at dinner one evening, and then again the next morning. When he finally found her in the library, a small trunk sitting open on the floor beside her, he felt something close to panic rise in his chest, a feeling sharper than anything he had experienced on the battlefield. "You are leaving," he said, his voice tight. "It is for the best, Your Grace," Cecilia replied, not meeting his eyes. "Your family needs the alliance with the Earl's daughter. I will not stand in the way of your duty." "And if I do not wish for that alliance?" he asked, stepping closer. "If I have spent every day since my return finding the only honest comfort I have known in your company." Cecilia finally looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Edmund, your family, your title, your entire future depends on choices far greater than what either of us might wish for ourselves." "My future," he said firmly, "depends on becoming a man worthy of the title I carry. And I cannot become that man by performing happiness in a marriage built on obligation, while the only person who has ever truly seen me, who saw me when I returned broken, and helped me find my way back, walks out of my life because she believes herself unworthy of staying." The following week, when the Earl of Whitmore and his daughter arrived at Ashworth Hall for what was meant to be a formal introduction toward marriage, Edmund stood before the gathered families, his mother, and the household staff, and spoke plainly. "I owe my family honesty, more than I owe them convenience," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of every eye upon him. "I returned from war a different man than the one who left, and for a long time, I believed I had to hide that truth from everyone who loved me. But one person saw through the performance, and chose to stay anyway, not for my title, not for my fortune, but for the man beneath it. I intend to spend the rest of my life beside her, if she will still have me." The room fell into stunned silence. The Earl's daughter, to her credit, offered a small, understanding smile, having clearly expected as much from the moment she observed the way the Duke's eyes searched the room for someone who was not present. The Dowager Duchess, after a long moment of consideration, found that her son's quiet strength reminded her very much of his late father, who had also chosen love over convenience many years before. Cecilia, who had been informed of none of this beforehand, arrived in the hall just as Edmund finished speaking, drawn by the unusual silence that had fallen over the household. When she saw him standing there, having chosen her openly before his entire family and the guests he had been expected to impress, she understood at last that the man before her was no longer hiding. Their wedding, held some months later, was not the grand political affair the Dowager Duchess had once imagined. It was smaller, quieter, attended by those who genuinely cared for the couple rather than those seeking advantage from the union. Edmund stood at the altar with steady hands and clear eyes, the trembling that had once haunted him now entirely gone. As Cecilia walked toward him, dressed simply but beautifully, the household staff who had watched their story unfold over many quiet months could not help but smile through their tears. They had witnessed a duke return from war broken in ways no metal could mend, and they had watched a quiet companion, overlooked by nearly everyone else, become the one steady presence that helped him find his way home, not to the estate he had been born to inherit, but to himself. In the years that followed, Ashworth Hall remained a place of warmth and honesty, where the Duke and Duchess raised their children to value truth over appearance, and where anyone who walked through its halls could sense that the love within its walls had never been built on performance, but on the rare and quiet courage of being truly seen.